Good evening, everybody. All right, so now is the moment that you've all been waiting for, where we get to talk about governance and regulations, including the securities laws, everybody's favorite subject in cryptocurrency. But please, I think that this is, I'm very excited to talk to you about this. You wouldn't think that I would be excited to come up and talk to you about the securities laws, but I am. I really am. And I think I can get across why in the next few minutes. And once we talk, we're only going to talk about governance and regulations for a few minutes, and then we're going to talk about the bigger picture of what we're all doing here and where this could go next, okay? So, one very important question that if you've been following along today, it's like, okay, we can create our tokens, anyone can create it. You saw how easy it was. By the way, how cool is it that we deployed the protocol and then we're able to create an R token live in the app the same day? Like, holy shit! That was awesome! Everybody on the team who built all that software, all of the planning and thinking, it's amazing. And we wanted to do that live to show you how extremely easy it is. You know, there's further complexity. You know, you saw all the little advanced fields. If you're really going to create something that's going to take over the world, you probably think about it and talk about it with your friends for weeks and whatever. But still, the actual creation is that easy, and anybody can do it with no permission. Sorry, I just got excited about that. But but now, if you're thinking, so should I make an R token? Remember, part of the idea with an R token is if you deploy it, you can give yourself a cut of the revenue. So you can basically sort of create this decentralized business for yourself that you earn some income from. If you create an R token and that gets really big, you could earn a significant amount of income for not really doing very much. You know, that's an attractive thing, and that's part of why we think many people could create R tokens. But a really legit question you might want to ask yourself is like, well, wait a minute. Am I doing something illegal when I create an R token? Am I breaking the law? Am I going to create an unregistered security? Are my local regulators going to think I'm bad for doing that? So let's talk about that. The answer is yes, maybe, if you do it wrong. But if you do it right, maybe no. And obviously, I am not a lawyer. And even if I were, I'm not your lawyer. So you need to consult with your own lawyer if you want to do a careful legal check of what I'm saying. I'm not here to give you legal advice, but I am here to share my own opinion and talk about the high-level contours of how one ought to think about this legally. And then if you're going to do this, check with your own lawyer. As it says in the slide in red. Okay. And for some reason on this screen, some emojis are not supported, so we're just going to fill this in ourselves. The question is an R token a security? We can break this down with two questions. Okay? The first question is it backed by securities or not? Is it backed by non-securities? If it's backed by securities, it's probably a security. It's pretty simple, right? So with like the sorts of things that say like Tom was talking about earlier, you know, where we tokenize all these equities and then put them all together in a basket and they're all securities, it's probably a security because it's a basket of a bunch of securities. Pretty straightforward, right? And I'll talk about why I think that's actually okay in the long term. But if it's backed by non-securities, then maybe it's not a security itself, okay? But then we have to think about the second question, which is the governance centralized or decentralized? Generally speaking, if the governance is highly centralized, I think it's pretty likely that your R token will still be considered a security because, and the fundamental reason for that is because the users of that R token are just depending on you or whatever that centralized governing body is to make good decisions about their capital, and you could do that in private, right? So they're depending on you, and they don't know, about you or your company or whatever it is that's governing the thing, and so you might screw them over, basically, right? And the securities laws exist to force centralized entities to disclose information to their investors, to basically make it so that it's harder to screw people over, right? So if you're governing in a private, centralized way, there's a good chance that the securities laws would apply to you. However, I believe that with some forms of sufficiently decentralized governance, and there are details to this that matter, that's where you really should consult a lawyer if you're nervous about this. I think it's possible to create a governance process that that is sufficiently transparent such that the securities laws don't apply, and that's sufficiently decentralized such that there's no body to which the securities laws would apply. So, because of that, we think that it's possible with our tokens like the one that Jens and Luis demoed creating, if that had sufficiently decentralized governance, it's possible that that would not be a security. Again, I can't give you legal advice. But let's talk about the securities laws for a minute, okay? Because most people in crypto think the securities laws are just a bad thing. They're just a thorn in our side that we have to deal with. But when you really focus on the securities laws deeply, which we've had to for a project like this, you start to see that the securities laws contain deep wisdom. They contain sort of deep knowledge about humans and people and how we work. That's actually really important. And the securities laws themselves are really important. So let me try to explain that. Let's say you run a company, and it's a private company. Nobody knows anything about what's happening inside that company, but you sold your shares in that company to a bunch of people in public. By default, all of your operations are private. So there's all this information that you're accumulating that your investors don't know about. So there's a natural information asymmetry. Even if you disclose everything that happened up until now, then one day goes by, and now there's all this private information again. And another month goes by, and there's a ton of private information again, because it's just naturally accumulating, okay? But the other thing is that, as that company, you want to be able to raise capital. You want to be able to sell your shares for as much as possible. And because of that, you have the natural incentive to share the positive information and kind of hide the dirty laundry. You're like, let's just not talk about the fact that that launch didn't go very well. Or, let's not talk about the fact that our numbers are sort of lower than we thought that they would be or something, right? And so that natural incentive to sort of hide the dirty laundry, it actually leads humans, all of us, me, you, everyone by default, to kind of start to lie a little bit, to not really fully disclose that information that the shareholders or would-be shareholders, people who are considering buying the shares, really need to know if they're going to make an informed decision. And fundamentally, like with a company, the way that the securities laws apply to issuers, to those companies, is it forces them to expose that dirty laundry. It forces them to, on a periodic basis, say stuff in public they really wouldn't have wanted to say if they had been given the choice. And that protects people in the public. You get that information. You probably don't read the documents on the securities websites, but if there's something that's really bad, it gets reported by reporters, it gets talked about on social media because they had to disclose it. And so, people complain about the formatting of the disclosure. I agree it's not the best, but the information gets out there, and that's actually an important thing. Similarly, we have I won't go into as much detail, but for centralized exchanges of stocks or even of crypto, these centralized exchanges have a lot of information that they're privy to that you're not privy to. They could very easily manipulate their books and do things to make money off of you at your expense. And humans will naturally end up doing things like that. Not everyone, but some will end up doing sketchy things like that. So the securities regulators go to exchanges and say, don't do that. Don't manipulate that stuff. You have to show us a bunch of your internal things so we can watch over you and make sure you're not doing that. So I'm trying to get the point across that the securities laws are actually, there's deep wisdom there. It actually makes a lot of sense. And we shouldn't just try to run from the securities laws. We should try to understand them. And where they apply, we should follow them. And but there's another cool possibility I'm going to talk about. So one thing that's really fascinating about cryptocurrencies and crypto platforms is that it's sometimes possible to create versions of these centralized things that needed the securities laws in a decentralized way that's very transparent, where there is no information asymmetry. There isn't any private information. And so the securities laws, I believe in those cases, are not necessary. Let me give you an example. With a centralized exchange like the New York Stock Exchange, they have all that data and it's all private and they can manipulate it if they want to. Let's take Uniswap. Who here is familiar with Uniswap? Good portion of people, although not everybody. Uniswap is a decentralized exchange on Ethereum where all of the trading happens in smart contracts. It's completely visible, and it's all done in a 100% automated way by the smart contracts. So there's no humans who can decide, we're going to change the mechanism and sort of do something, to skim a little bit off for ourselves. MEV is another topic, but that still happens in public. And it's going to be solved because it's happening in public, right? And so the point there is that if the SEC or some securities regulator went to Uniswap and said, hey, we need you to disclose all the information about everything in your exchange, it's like, bro, it's all there. It's all completely public from the start. And so that's a really cool example where the securities laws no longer apply. I'm not talking about in form. Maybe in form there's some law that technically applies, but in spirit, the thing that they're meant to do, the reason why we have them, is not necessary there because you've taken the humans out of the loop and you've made it all public. And so there's no way that people can screw other people over in that situation. Now, that's a more clear example, but I think it's also possible to do that with governance. I think that there can probably be decentralized governance approaches where all of the decision-making and all of the actions happen in public, and they all happen in a way where you get the information about any new update long before it would apply to you and determine your financial destiny. So let me give you an example. Let's say there's an R token, and it's backed all by dollar assets. And that's cool with you because you wanted a thing that was stable against the dollar. And then the governors decide, you know what? We don't like the dollar, we're switching, and it's all going to be gold-based, okay? If they make that change, if the governance protocol that they used is such that they make the change, and then there's many days or maybe many weeks between the time when that change, they made the change and the change is actually implemented, that means that 100% of the information that could affect you about that asset is totally visible on-chain for some period of time. You have the time to process that and decide, you know what, I'm not interested in this new future. I'm going to go somewhere else, right? And so that you can have this programmatically enforced disclosure that doesn't require a regulator like the SEC to force those governors to disclose that information. It just gets disclosed on-chain by default, right? Communication amongst governors, I think, is a tougher challenge. I would like to be able to create decentralized governing bodies where 100% of discussion, even before those votes or decisions or whatever, is completely public. And one way I've thought about doing this, I wasn't going to talk about this idea, but I'm just going to say it. Maybe it's crazy, but I want people to think about this. What if there was a decentralized governing mechanism that had baked into it a little like sort of governing body that was like the SEC? It's like a little mini SEC in your DAO, which I know that sounds terrible, but hear me out. Who wants an SEC in their DAO? I do. The little mini SEC in the DAO, what it does is it basically polices everyone else who's participating in the process, and they have the ability to like kick you out if they detect that you are communicating with others in the DAO privately. There's approved public communication channels. You can do all of your discussion in public, and if they think you're colluding and talking privately, boom, you're out, right? You're kicked out by the little DAO or the SEC in the DAO. So that's the sort of thing I'm talking about where you could end up enforcing decentralized governing mechanisms where you really, really, truly are doing the thing that the securities laws are designed to do. So you're not just running from them, just sort of like on a technicality, being like, well, technically it's not a security because blah, blah, complicated argument. It's like, no, here's an argument why, but also here's like a really good reason why we don't need that regime for this whole era. So I'm super excited about that. And I hope that by our tokens being able to have any governance protocol that people want, we'll get an enormous amount of exploration and research into decentralized governance, right? Because we'll be governing the same sorts of things over and over again. You get to see how different things play out in relatively similar circumstances, and you could have tens or hundreds of different governance protocols, maybe thousands, but it's a little crazy, and see how they all go. And so I hope that, that we'll get to that point where we unambiguously have our tokens with very well-designed decentralized governance mechanisms backed by non-securities that are clearly not securities. And I think in the short term, that's a really big deal. Let me see if I have, so in the short term, that's a really big deal because today, if a crypto asset is deemed a security, it's pretty much fucked. And what I mean by that is there are no exchanges or fintech platforms that are happy to take your crypto securities and allow you to trade them and send them around to other people because there's a bunch of laws about which exchanges are allowed to touch securities. And the regulations haven't caught up yet. So today, it's very important that our tokens not be securities if they are going to be broadly used on centralized exchange platforms and fintech companies and so on. And so that's why, like for the next, 5 years or so, I think that where the action is at is creating these very decentralized things that legitimately are not securities that can thus be used in the existing crypto ecosystem as it continues to expand. Now, I do think that in the future, there's no good reason why securities regulators won't end up having a good accommodation for crypto securities, right? There's no reason to not have a way for like DAOs to basically register their assets that are deemed securities or companies, for that matter, to securities regulators, and to just have a sensible regulatory framework where you can use those on a whole bunch of different platforms. So I do personally believe that's going to happen. And if you look at the headlines and you read between the lines a little bit, it seems like the things that Gary Gensler is saying and the things the SEC is doing are in that direction. They're basically saying, look, you know, all these crypto things, you have to come talk to us and register. Also the exchanges, we're going to get you set up to trade securities. At least that's what I think is going on. So in the long term, what that means is that it's not bad to create any of these. It's okay to create R tokens that are backed by securities with centralized or decentralized governance. Some of them may be securities, and you'll have to follow the rules to do that. But you know, I have a little bit of faith in regulators. Even though it's slow, even though it can be frustrating, I do think over the course of time, it's very possible that we actually accommodate this new technology in all of its craziness. So, okay. So, when creating let's talk a little bit about governance. Thank you for hearing me out on the securities laws. I hope you've learned something interesting about securities. When you're creating a new governance mechanism for an R token, there are a couple of core economic functions that you have to take into account. So one is, you know, obviously the basket selection itself. It's like, what's in the basket? And should we change the basket? That's the most obvious thing. And so it's important to look at the underlying asset, to look at the yield that the assets could generate, and to look at the risk level. And then the second thing is the revenue distribution. It's like, okay, if the R token generates revenue, where does that go? That's the other core economic decision that governance needs to make. And so your options include the R token holders themselves, RSR stakers, the governors, the founders, some platform that supports it, or anything else. And you know, as someone pointed out earlier, I forget who, you know, it's just an open thing. So you could send it to a charity. You could experiment in many different ways. But there's some core challenges if you're thinking about how do we improve upon governance. So one is you have to somehow get a bunch of people to produce and act on sort of deep technical knowledge, like choosing assets. Especially imagine you have a big R token, you know, billions of dollars worth of value, and it's like, okay, cool, random token holders, let's just do a vote and decide what that starts to sound scary, right? You need people who are experts, who really understand, who develop the deep technical knowledge, and who make good decisions. So that's like the obvious core thing. Second, you know, it needs to be robust to bad actors. We talked earlier about the issues where, you know, if you just buy enough coins, you could potentially distort the governance process. You also have to represent different interests, right? So, for example, you know, with the sort of simple coin voting, that gives you sort of the whaleocracy, right? Versus like you could have like a thing that's sort of like, you know, one person, one vote, like more democracy, or you could have something that's more like, you know, technocracy, what's, you know, governed by people who sort of have the relevant technical knowledge. But there's different ways of doing governance, and they'll represent vastly different sets of interests in the system. And then there's the challenges with decentralization and transparency we just talked about in relation to securities laws. So we have started recently working with a group called Bismarck Analysis. They're not directly part of the Reserve Project, but they are folks who have been studying. It's kind of crazy, actually. It's kind of these folks who have tried to understand like the entire history of governance in the history of humanity. They're sort of the biggest governance geeks that we've ever met, and we've commissioned them to help with designing what's a next step, right? If we're saying, you know, as Taylor said earlier, simple token voting not sufficient. I'm not going to say it's broken, but it's not sufficient for the long term. What does the next thing look like? And so I want to share with you very briefly a research direction that Bismarck is looking at. I wish they could have been here to talk about it because it's much more interesting when they talk about it. But the basic idea is, okay, well, what if we sort of copied something from normal human governance and we had a representative body that had the relevant technical knowledge, and then we had RSR staker voting as well to represent the broad body of RSR stakers. The idea here is that the representative body would be in charge of creating a whitelist of collateral tokens, basically going through and being like, all right, these collateral tokens are at least like not scams. These are things that like it's fine to add these to your basket. We wouldn't necessarily advise you to do so, but they've been checked, for sort of basic things. And then the representative body might also operate some of the deeper technical R token parameters, like exactly how many days do you have to wait to unstake and things like that. Whereas the RSR stakers could still vote to choose the actual basket, but again from that whitelisted universe rather than all tokens. They could also choose the distribution of yields, and we could even give them veto power over a lot of the things that the representative body did. That way, if the representative body sort of starts going rogue and doing something sketchy, the RSR stakers can kind of take that control back, right? So it's sort of delegating control to a body of experts is the basic idea. And I'm just going to leave this here for a second, so that if you're watching this later on YouTube and you're one of the 4 governance nuts in the world who's going to be super excited to go into this, you can see if you can follow along in this diagram. The basic idea is, anyway, we're good. And that's all I had to share with you about the securities laws and governance. Suffice it to say that, today marks the beginning of what I hope will be an explosion of research into decentralized governance in this particular ecosystem. There's already tons of that happening in the Ethereum world and crypto more broadly. But we really hope that the fact that you can just click those buttons and deploy a new one and start tweaking with things is going to allow more experimentation than we've seen before. All right. So last thing, and then we're going to have dinner and we can party all night. We have this venue as long as we want. The last thing, but it's really important. I want to talk to you about commercial revolutions. So, first off, we're going to talk about 3 things and narrow in on what we're talking about here. What is a movement, okay? Of movement, so we have 3 examples here. The civil rights movement in the United States, the environmentalist movement around the world, and the effective altruism movement, okay? If we think about what is it that motivates people to spend their time and devote their lives to the activities that are typically involved in movements. You're usually trying to cause some change in the world. And so I noticed 2 main motivations. One is to actually improve things, where you're like, I don't like that the world is this way. I'm going to actually try to change it just because I want it to be different. And then there's another motivation that's very nearby, but it's a little bit different, which is I want to be a hero. I want to be the person who made that change. Not only do I want that change to happen, I want to be the person who made it. So it's better if I made it than if you made it, right? Because I want that sort of heroship, right? These are 2 big motivations that I see that drive people to come together and execute in movements, all right? Now, let's talk about industries, okay? Industries are very, very different from movements, right? So here we have these examples of the electrical industry, the personal computing industry, and the air travel industry. What are people generally motivated by when they're running an industry? Well, it's pretty straightforward. Profit, right? They want to make money. It's usually not the case that people, the people who are running the electrical grid, they're not doing it because there's something that they really wanted to change or they really wanted to be a hero. They're like, this is a good business. Let's do it. That's legit. Now, but there's something really interesting, which is new industries. When an industry is new, like at the very beginning of the electricity industry, or the very beginning of the personal computing industry, or the very beginning of the air travel industry, those people, the things that they did, the things that motivated them were not just profit. It's actually kind of a combination of like the industry motivations and the movement motivations. So there's people who, they want to improve a particular thing because they can see that it's possible and they think that'd be awesome. Sometimes they want to be a hero, they want to be the person who did it, or maybe they're helping and they're not necessarily trying to be a hero, but they want to make the change. And they can see, if this works out, we could make a lot of money. We could be the first in this industry, and that could be a big deal. So you get all three of those motivations coming together. You're trying to make money, you're trying to make a change, you're trying to be a hero in a new industry. And these periods usually last a very short period of time, right? Because it's just getting going. Any new industry that's successful, it just turns into a big industry, and it's like, okay, now it's just profit. And that's because, the people who want to make change, if you want to make a change, you want to be a hero, you can't just go work in an existing industry because you're just, perpetuating the status quo, right? So those people get attracted to new industries. And so what is a new industry called? Like, is there a word for this? And this painting is of the Industrial Revolution. And I think if you think about it, the Industrial Revolution, it's sort of, on a very macro scale, was sort of this huge, huge new industry, many different industries. But it was that same sort of thing where at the beginning, there's a lot of fervor, a lot of excitement. People could tell the world was changing a lot. People were in there for many different reasons. But I think that leads us to the word that we need to describe what's happening here in crypto, with reserve and asset-backed currencies, which is revolutions, like the Industrial Revolution. So at the beginning, that new industry, I'm going to call that a revolution. And I'm not talking about a violent revolution or a political revolution. I'm talking about a commercial revolution. It's sort of a commercial and technological revolution, but there can still be those ideological drives, that desire to change the world, that brings people in and causes them to work ridiculous amounts in order to make something happen, which I'm sure was the case for all three of these examples. Now, interestingly, I believe that there are some of these commercial revolutions happening in cryptocurrency already, right? If you look at, sort of cryptocurrency, like Bitcoin and just the idea of cryptocurrency, that itself, especially early on, you see all three of these. You see idealists, heroes, and capitalists coming together. With Ethereum and smart contracts, right? The smart contract revolution, again, idealists, heroes, and capitalists. And you have some people who are like just doing ICOs, some people who are like trying to change the way that humanity functions. And then with DeFi, we're getting that built on top of smart contracts, right? So now, again, you have idealists, heroes, and capitalists who are building these applications that are smart contract based, like the example we gave over here of a decentralized exchange. Some people who build stuff like that don't just do it for money. They do it because they're like, wow, this would be incredible if this existed. And there's all sorts of things being built on smart contracts today that have those sorts of motivations. So when I say commercial revolutions, that's what I'm talking about. And commercial revolutions get power from both competition and from cooperation. It's this weird thing where anybody, once this sort of kicks off, anyone can invent. Anyone can try their hand at creating an airplane that's going to fly once we've realized, oh my God, we could create machines that fly. Anybody can build that. And to put this in perspective, imagine that it weren't open. Imagine that with cryptocurrency, Bitcoin was invented, and somehow the idea of cryptocurrency had been patented, okay? So that only one company on the planet was allowed to develop crypto technology and add things and progress, right? Imagine how slow that would be, how little crypto would have progressed from Bitcoin until now over those 12 or 13 or however many years, if it was only one company that was allowed to touch it. But the fact that it's open and everyone can copy and compete and innovate and do different things and whatever, that produces so much more movement forward. And so that competition is like a huge thing, and the openness. And so anyone can try their hand at making that change, at being a hero, or at turning a profit. But the thing is, there's also cooperation that happens. If you look at the crypto industry, people are often pretty friendly with each other. And there's many different groups. There's sort of these meta-level, lobbying groups and so on, where it's like we all want to work together, to change laws or to educate people about the true nature of crypto. We all want to make sure that people know that crypto is not only for buying drugs. There's lots of cooperation that happens, even though there's all this competition happening. And it's something really special about a commercial revolution. And that's part of what we're hoping to actually ignite in this new ecosystem. So I'm here to introduce you to the idea of the asset-backed currency revolution. And that's what this is. That's what is happening right now. So with the ideas that have sort of been mushed together by the people in the reserve community and the reserve team, and the technologies that have been built so far, and the things that we're talking about today, and the things that we're enabling, I believe that we are starting the asset-backed currency revolution. And it's a technological revolution, it's a commercial revolution, it's not a violent revolution, it's not a political revolution. It's not against any particular government or any particular party or anything like that. It's just a new way of doing things that we think is better, and if other people agree, it could end up growing and taking over. And because it's a new industry, because it's a revolution, it's attracting idealists and heroes and capitalists. It's not just people who want to make money, it's not just people who want to make change, it's that powerful combination of all three. And so, you can see with the fact that not just us, but anyone who creates an R token or anyone who stakes, there's all those different financial incentives that we've carefully planned out. It's because we want to create this perfect storm of these three different motivations to actually get to our end goal, which, as we've acknowledged many times on stage today, we don't know the full answer. We don't even know if it's possible. We don't even know if it ultimately will work to have a diverse basket of assets that people really use as money. We just think it might. And so we're inviting other people who think it might work to come try it out. So the idea, let's see. So the idea is very simple, right? The idea that we started with is just, what if we transacted directly with the same assets that we already use to store our wealth? Everybody wants to store value, and everybody wants to have the liquidity to easily transact with any person or business in the world, right? That's why we hold money, is to have that liquidity. If we didn't need that liquidity, we would just hold assets that retain their value more than money. We have to have some cash because we need that liquidity. So the basic idea is, well, what if we just combine those into one thing? So we didn't have to have some of each, right? What if we bundled those two different functions? That's the basic idea of the asset-backed currency revolution. And so anyone can try to do that. And what we're trying to do by creating this open platform, rather than just being one little node, we're inviting that revolution in. We're saying, look, if you want to be a part of the asset-backed currency revolution, here's a thing that you can build on top of. Here's an area you can hang out in. You can come to our events. You can hang out, in our online communities. You can build on our software. You can exchange ideas with us, and we hope that will lead to a lot of competition amongst different R tokens and cooperation amongst the entire ecosystem. And by the way, it's obviously it's not just reserve, right? Like, if this starts to pick up, it's not like no one else is going to create a smart contract-based platform to do something like this. Once anything like this starts to pick up and people start to get credit and be famous or make money or whatever, there will be imitators. And so there can be a whole ecosystem even beyond reserve. It's exciting, I know, I'm very excited too. That's exactly how I feel right now. Okay, so with that in mind, what's going to happen now? So in order to spur this along, we're going to be focused, like I said earlier today, on ecosystem building, R token integrations, and governance research. And the long-term goal, again, I know this sounds insane, but the long-term goal is to end up having someone eventually create a world reserve currency that retains its value indefinitely and isn't too volatile, is stable enough in value that you can really use it as money. And if it, like we said in the video this morning, if it completely works, it could entirely replace money. I know that we're nowhere near that, and who knows if it's even possible, but that is the long-term goal. So let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges, okay? If you're here, you might be interested in this goal too. You might be relevant to overcoming some of these challenges. Challenge number one, we won't order them. One challenge is everything must be tokenized, right? We're talking about creating baskets of all these assets that are not tokenized yet. It's pretty straightforward. The things need to be tokenized. Why hasn't that happened? The answer is basically regulation, or policy and regulation. And so those things need to evolve a bit, I think, for this to really work. The next thing is, as we talked about, decentralized governance must be functional. You have to hit all those pillars we talked about before. And then the third thing is that the securities laws have to permit it. This goes back to the beginning of my presentation. So you can imagine a world where assets get tokenized, governance systems are functional, but for some reason, the securities laws are just like too bureaucratic and too gummed up, and it ends up being that like only 2 exchanges on Earth are able to trade these, crypto assets that are securities. And it's like, well, great. We lose, right? Because in that scenario, then you can't easily, send the assets to any different wallet and every different exchange and use them in commerce and whatever. It would be way too locked down. So the securities laws have to be sufficiently open to this possible change, for this to really work out. But one cool thing about that, I'll add, is that right now, when people are designing governance systems, there's that important goal in mind of like, and it must be sufficiently decentralized and transparent that it's not a security because of our short-term predicament. In the long term, if we have updated securities laws that really make sense, that's sort of a diss on securities laws, updated securities laws that have adapted to crypto, then governance design no longer needs to be constrained by securities laws because it's okay to have securities. And so I actually think we'll get even better governance systems once we have an overall regime throughout the world where it's okay for crypto assets to be securities. So, with all of that in mind, is it going to work? Are we actually going to do this? Like, is this going to lead, is this mini revolution that's sort of starting in this room going to lead to a world reserve currency? And so it's like the goal is very simple, money that doesn't lose its value. The plan is not very original, to be honest. It's not like this is like a crazy idea. We're talking about taking normal, boring assets that we already use to store our wealth and just, bundling them together. It's like, that's not that crazy to do. We're talking about doing it on Ethereum, which is like, if you're going to pick a smart contract platform, it's like the easiest choice. It's like, well, which one? Ethereum, not, very boring. Governed by a DAO. At this point, there's like tons of DAOs. It's like DAO. What's a DAO? I don't know. Right? So the whole thing, in a sense, is not very original. And yet, reserve is a really crazy idea because of all those things that still have to go right for it to work, which they're out of our control. We don't know if those things are going to happen. And so, to put that in context, it's like, as a society, we decided no on private currencies a long time ago. There's a whole history conversation about that, but we tried not having the government be in control of currencies and allowing private, businesses and citizens to issue them. We decided no on that, basically because people abuse that power the same way that governments abuse that power. Almost nothing has been tokenized yet, and decentralized governance is super young, it's super scary, and so it's just, why would we think this is going to work? And so I think that it's not just, I'm crazy, obviously, but you are also crazy. Like, why are you here? I can easily list all the reasons why this could completely not work, and yet we're all in this room. Like, what are we doing here, right? What are we doing? You guys are crazy. And you watching the video, you're crazy too. And the thing is, at the very beginning of a revolution, you usually find crazy people, right? Because at the very beginning, there's a lot of things that seem like they're maybe not going to work, or they only seem like they're going to work if you have some very particular view of the world, which maybe some of us have. Or if you've lived the problem and you understand that it's a big fucking deal and you're like, we don't know how to make it work, but we're going to try anyway, right? I think that's true for a bunch of people on the reserve team. They joined being like, I don't know if this is going to work, but I feel ya. Like, let's try to do it, And I think that's true for a lot of people in this room. So, all right, this is a little bit more boring, but I think it's necessary. Some example challenges that are beyond our direct control. Do people or businesses actually create interesting R tokens? We're not going to do it. You guys have to do that. Or people, other people in the future have to do that. Does crypto overall figure out decentralized governance? Does the SEC allow tokenization of securities and the public holding and trading of security tokens? What about in other countries, right? Maybe half the countries of the world, the securities laws work and half they don't. What do we do then? And then also a bigger thought is just, do nation states end up having an allergic reaction to asset-backed currencies, right? It's a stark contradiction to how we think about money today. Maybe they won't receive it very well. So there's lots of different things that are out of our control that may make this not work. Let me talk, though, about what the core team plans to do to incrementally move this forward, because we do see ways to incrementally move this forward and make it more and more plausible that this could overall work out. One is obvious. It's growing RPay, right? A lot of people in this room are from the RPay team. We've been working, well, no, I should say we. They have been working their asses off to get to the point that we're at, that Josh was able to show you sort of the progress we've achieved. But we want that to be global, right? The goal is to have a single money platform that's usable everywhere, that has liquidity and accessibility everywhere, and all sorts of things built on top of it. Very similar to the Moby vision. And the crypto vision overall, right? It's not just us. There's a bunch of different teams trying to do this. Again, it's good to have competition and cooperation at the same time. Second is educating our token creators, right? Like setting people up to be able to do this. Pursuing our token integrations, like we will put in our own effort to try to have our tokens be usable, to get them into, say, fintech platforms that maybe ordinary people that don't touch crypto would still be able to use them in, so that you would actually get this point where it's like, oh, I could have my money in dollars or in euros in this platform, or I could switch to this other weird new thing that's some basket that has these different properties. We're going to be offering grants to the broader ecosystem in order to fund a bunch of this. We'll be doing governance R&D ourselves, protocol discussion and ideation, so like our team will continue to think about the protocol, how it could be better. We're interested in helping with tokenization, but we don't know how to do that yet. And like I said earlier today, we'll be protecting the reserve brand. We think this is an important thing for the ecosystem, for our tokens to have their own brand. So again, if you make an R token and you call it reserve something something, I'm going to tweet at you and be like, no, that's lame, don't do that, and we're not going to support you, and like negative energy compared to if you make an awesome brand that's independent. But I really think that we need a revolution. Like, for this all to happen, it's going to take more than we're going to be able to do ourselves. So, and I think you guys get the picture why, so we don't need to belabor it. Luckily, in crypto, there are tons of different people and projects that have pretty aligned incentives, pretty aligned sets of things that they're trying to figure out. And so it's not just us. It's not just the asset-backed currency revolution in a vacuum. It's the asset-backed currency revolution in the context of the broader cryptocurrency and smart contract and DeFi revolution that's underway. And we can fit nicely inside of that. And these sorts of revolutions are not hypothetical. This has happened in crypto already, right? So Satoshi did not do almost anything that has to do with Bitcoin other than the original, like sort of creating it originally, right? Satoshi did not create the exchanges, didn't create the laser eye memes, didn't create the Lightning Network. Like, so many things have been done that are beyond Satoshi. Vitalik, did not really create the Ethereum ecosystem, right? Think about all the things that exist in the Ethereum ecosystem, everything that's been built on top of it, et cetera. These take these big revolutions. So, all right, what does it look like if it actually works? I want to take like 2 or 3 minutes and talk through a story. This is just a made-up story of what success could look like for the asset-backed currency revolution really succeeding in the context of reserve. Imagine that we start off with some R tokens in DeFi. There's early R tokens that are not securities. They're supported by RPay, Binance, Coinbase, FTX, etc. Again, this is a made-up story. One successful R token, grows and becomes popular. Let's say it gets to 100 million, 200 million in TVL, and people are like, oh, this is cool. We can see how this works. I think that just having that one R token that gets to a moderate size like that could then attract a whole bunch more people to attempt to create R tokens as a way to make money, right? Because if you make an R token and you're able to get a cut of revenue, then you could have sort of passive income. That's an attractive thing for people in crypto. So similar to what happened with Ethereum, where once there was one big successful ICO, everyone was like, oh my God, we all want to do ICOs. I think we could see a similar thing, although I think it would be much more muted, right? Because with an ICO, it's like millions in free money, right? Like that attracted tons of hucksters in 2017. I hope that this will not be like that, because with an R token, the money you're making is sort of legitimate revenue that comes from actual value provided, which means the numbers are a lot smaller, but it's a lot more legitimate. So we could have sort of a miniature experience, something similar like that. Imagine now we get to the point where there's an R token with $1 billion or let's say R tokens overall have $1 billion in combined TVL, total value locked. I think crossing the billion mark would then put us to a state of getting more attention and bring in more energy to build than we have today, certainly, and that we would have with just a few smaller R tokens. So I think the billion mark is a big deal. Now imagine, let's say we got past that billion mark, and there's more and more R tokens being created, lots of activity. Like the crypto ecosystem now, you can say R token to like most people, and they know what you mean, right? And that's, now we get to the point where maybe we really get this governance playground that I'm talking about. Because now you have more people thinking about it, more people tinkering with like, well, how could we tweak the governance to make this better, to make it more decentralized, to make it safer, et cetera. And so you start to get strong patterns, like governance patterns. And governance is not just about the mechanism. It's not just about the code. It's about the social norms and the people and the sort of social fabric that emerge that ends up being part of what governs. So you start to build governing communities of people. Now, okay, here's a left turn. Now, somebody creates a competitor to what's called the DTCC. The DTCC is essentially a body that holds, I'm going to simplify here, they like hold all of the stock certificates. So if you have like some Apple stock, there is sort of a certificate, kind of, I don't even know if it's on paper or not, but the DTCC is sort of ultimately in custody of that. And then if you trade to me through some brokerage or exchange, eventually some series of tubes happens and like some clearing happens to the point where the DTCC, like through some chain of ownership, it's clear that I own it. They have sort of a monopoly on this. Imagine that somebody created a DTCC competitor where you could instead custody those stock certificates with this other body over here. Except this other body over here does this really interesting thing. They say, we're just going to do like a one token to one share setup, and we're going to tokenize all these. So we're going to hold them for you, but we'll just give you the token, or we'll give the token to your brokerage or whatever, but you can also withdraw it and have it yourself, right? So you could have a sort of underlying stock certificate custodian, maybe, I'm just bullshitting here, but that could sort of drive a tokenization revolution, tokenizing a whole bunch of public equities and assets all at once. Let's just wave our hands and say this happens. So at that point, if that happened, tokenized stocks and stuff would just swamp into DeFi, right? Uniswap would suddenly have, all the equities that are inside of that market and whatever other assets are there too. Lending markets, Compound and Aave and Euler and so on, Maple, like all these different things. It's like, oh my gosh, now we have access to like all of the normal financial assets. Like right now, we're just playing with like these weird crypto assets that like only some people are willing to touch. So, I mean, just think about like the crazy, that's sort of some other revolution, sort of like the overall financial industry revolution if that all flows over. Now, at this point, it will become obvious to everybody that making baskets of these assets is like something that people are going to want, right? Like ETFs are super popular. Mutual funds are super popular. Like aggregating together assets into baskets and allowing people to hold that is already very popular just for the sake of storing value. Those are not used as a means of exchange, right? That's just for storing value. It's already a massively proven market. So obviously, people are going to try to create baskets in the token ecosystem if we have all those traditional financial assets that a lot of people want to hold. What I'm betting is that the reserve community could be pretty far ahead at that point. We could have this platform, have a bunch of decentralized protocols for governance, have a bunch of governing communities, a bunch of experience with how things do and don't work. And it would be the obvious natural platform to start doing that, to start creating those baskets. Probably initially for store of value, because it's like pretty wild to start going to merchants and trying to convince them to accept that. But so initially as store of value. Now, so now let's say that happens. So we start having these baskets. some of those R tokens end up available in RPay, on Binance, on Coinbase, etc. Let's say that the securities laws are willing to accommodate that. And now several copycat decentralized, basket platforms start popping up, right? It's not just Reserve in that world. Obviously, there'd be competition. All of these different platforms, it'll end up being a category, like automated market makers or decentralized lending. Other platforms can normalize this and turn this into a pattern. And so then, now imagine that there's continual growth as that ecosystem matures, and various types of people and institutions migrate to holding assets with those baskets that are very convenient. Now imagine that we get to this point where the total value locked is above 500 billion, right? We crossed the billion mark a long time ago now. This holding has grown a lot. There's more than 500 billion in assets. That's just a random number. It's just a random big number. And it's a growing way to store value very simply worldwide, right? Like with the sort of technologies that we were talking about today, Mobi and RPay and so on, it's like, dink, and now you're exposed to this different basket of assets. That's something where, in some countries that's already easy to do, in some places that's not easy to do. Making that available worldwide could be big. Now here's a crazy leap. Now imagine that that nation states actually hold a fair amount of other bonds from other governments. Those bonds from other governments are a shaky thing if they start to worry about the sort of stability of the currency of those other governments. Those bonds start to lose their value. You might be like, well, maybe we should put 2% or 5% in other assets. Imagine that nation states were to choose to use R tokens as a way to do that, because they can hold them themselves, right? You can hold the R token yourself, so you're in full control of that. You're not trusting a whole sort of chain of intermediaries for your particular account. There are the underlying tokenizers, but you yourself are sort of, in a sovereign way, holding that basket of assets. So I think that could be an attractive way for a nation state to diversify its own holdings, through central banks and treasuries and so on. Now, if that happened, that would be a huge legitimizing factor to these asset-backed tokens, right? It's like, well, these 17 countries actually have them on their balance sheet. Now imagine, I know there's like a zillion, and this and this and this, it's part of the point, but now imagine that some other nation that hadn't done that is undergoing hyperinflation. And they can come to see that whether they like it or not, their country is going to switch to using some other fiat currency that's stable. This happens. This happened in Venezuela. You get to the point where it's like, all right, we got to switch to something else. What's it going to be? In that scenario, I can imagine a nation state thinking, looking at that track record, being like, okay, all these countries are using this asset to store the value for the country, and it's actually relatively stable. Do we want, another fiat currency controlled by some other foreign government for our citizens to hold and spend, or do we want this thing that's actually going to be more stable for our own citizens, and where we're not sort of putting monetary policy into the hands of some other foreign government that's not necessarily aligned with us? I think that could potentially be an attractive option. I don't know. I haven't ever talked to these people, so I'm just making this up. But it logically makes sense to me. And so now imagine that some nation that it was undergoing hyperinflation decides to switch to this asset-backed R token, or currency on another platform, but let's say R token, instead of switching to another fiat currency. Think about what that would be like. We would reach this, we'd be on the precipice of this moment. They'd announced that this has happened. And the entire world would hold its breath for however many weeks or months to be like, is this going to work? Right? It's like, is something going to explode? Is this really fine? Can you just run your economy on a basket of assets instead of normal fiat currencies like we've been doing for a long time? And now imagine, oh my God, it works, right? Imagine how mind-blowing it would be. It's like, oh my gosh, the economy of this country is now running on this currency that's a different kind of currency. It's an asset-backed currency. And think about what that would do to the world, where it's like, wow, now we have this live example. We can look at all the, sort of inflation rates and devaluation of currencies, and it's like, that one's doing pretty well. And that country is running their entire economy on it. That's pretty neat. Kind of makes you think, right? Imagine that happened. I mean, and so at that point, I have to think that people and businesses worldwide would start to feel a little bit less sure that it makes sense to continue using the system of money where there's sort of the constant devaluation. You're like, well, wait a minute. We're doing this, but we could do that? Like, they're doing that, you know? That's a pretty interesting situation. And so I think individual savings and businesses, business treasury management in our tokens could continue to grow. And other transactional use cases start popping up. So notice, this whole time, I was not saying that a whole bunch of people would switch to transacting in it. That happened in that one country, and that was a big tipping point. But most our token usage up to this point was just store of value in this hypothetical. But at this point, I think people might start to switch and maybe use it a little bit transactionally, kind of in the way that the crypto industry does actually transact in crypto. You know, we pay for things in Bitcoin. We pay for things in ETH. We pay for things in dollar stablecoins, and it's not that weird. And you could start to get people doing actual transactions at that point where it's that normalized. And so you can imagine, at this point, like, I don't know how long it's taken to get there, but imagine like aging millennials in their 50s and 60s are cautiously accepting the idea of asset-backed currency, and the Zoomers are like, we're down, let's do it, let's switch, right? So at this point, you can imagine, the old narratives about private money, which worked a completely different way, by the way, than asset-backed currencies, would start to be forgotten and replaced with this new trust in this new form of private currency over central banks. Major currencies, I think, would not lose their network effects for the next 100 or 200 or, I don't know, like a long period of time. I think only when a currency really falters would a population switch to something else like an R token. So I'm not here to try to say, and then R tokens would invade, the Eurozone and take over the Euro, whatever. I don't really think that that's how it would happen. I really think it's only when something is really falling apart that, an entire population could choose to switch to something else. But that does happen with fiat currencies. Every once in a while, they fall apart. And if you keep waiting, they sort of all end up falling apart eventually. And so you could have this situation where one by one, over decades, centuries, you slowly switch. It's not a coordinated switch, like switching to the gold standard or kind of switching away from the gold standard. It could be a sort of passive organic thing. So maybe eventually, a generation or two from now, you can imagine leaders of nations getting together and officially deciding we're going to sunset the fiat standard. We've decided fiat money, not the way we're going to do it. We're going to do it in this other way. We're going to transact with fractions of the world's wealth instead. And it could actually become a fully legitimized thing that like all of the most powerful nations end up supporting. And then in the year 2400, a website launches called WTFHappenedIn2022.com. Okay, but so obviously that was just a story. I don't know if any of that will actually happen, and neither do you. But the thing is, I can imagine that happening if there is a strong revolution that turns into a powerful industry around asset-backed currencies. Without a strong revolution, I honestly am much more skeptical that anything like what I just described could actually play out. But if there is a very strong revolution, I could imagine that happening. So the question I want to leave you with, I hope you're feeling a little bit confused. We talked about confusion at the beginning of the day. I hope you're feeling a little bit confused. The question I want to leave you with, remember, hold on to your confusion, is do you personally want to be a part of the asset-backed currency revolution? That is the question that I want you to contemplate. and this place is ours for the rest of the night. We can do whatever we want. So let's all hang out and talk about it and figure out what to do. Thank you for coming.